She had her eyes closed when I walked out onto the patio, so she didn't see me stop. I had come outside to check if the gas line on the grill was still leaking, a completely ordinary reason to open a back door on a Saturday afternoon, the kind of errand that should take 45 seconds and leave no trace. Instead, I stood on the step with my hand still on the door frame and looked at Mara Delacroix lying on a sun lounger in the backyard of the house I used to share with her sister. And for a long and incriminating moment, I forgot entirely what I had come out there to do. She turned her head. I was still looking. There was no version of the next 5 seconds that worked in my favor. She didn't say anything for a moment. She reached sideways without looking, picked up the sunscreen from the small table beside the lounger, and held it out in my direction. "Can you help me with my back?" she said. Her voice had the same quality it always had, like she already knew the answer to every question she asked, and was asking purely as a formality. I had known Mara for 6 years. For 5 of those 6 years, she had been my sister-in-law. For the last 11 months, she had been my ex-wife's sister, which is a different thing, a thing that carries a different weight and a completely different set of rules. She was 31. I was 34. The divorce from Claire had been final for 8 months, and the reason Mara was sunbathing in what was now technically my backyard, because I had kept the house in the settlement. A decision that had seemed practical at the time, and now seemed like the universe's way of telling me it had a very specific sense of humor, was that she was in town for 6 weeks, while her apartment was being renovated, and Claire had asked me. In that carefully measured way Claire had of asking for things that were not optional, if her sister could stay here because it was closer to Mara's job and Claire's new place didn't have a guest room. I had said yes. Of course I had said yes. I was 34 years old, 11 months out of a marriage, and apparently still not in possession of a functional sense of self-preservation. I walked across the patio and took the sunscreen from her hand. What happened next is the reason I'm telling this story, and I want to be careful about how I tell it, because there are several people in it who deserve more consideration than the easy version of events would give them. The easy version is the one that fits a familiar shape. The ex-husband, the sister, the house full of someone else's history. I am not interested in the easy version. I am interested in what was actually happening, which was considerably more complicated and considerably more honest. Mara and I had always had a specific kind of relationship, not charged, not fraught, not the thing you're thinking of. It was more like. We were the same type of person in a way that Claire and I had never quite been, and we had both known that and filed it away without discussing it, because discussing it would have been a betrayal of something real, and the cost of that betrayal was too high. She was direct in a way Claire wasn't. She said difficult things without softening them first. She had strong opinions about things that mattered, and no opinions about things that didn't, which is a distribution I find rare and genuinely attractive in a person. She read the same kind of books I read, and disagreed with me about them in specific ways that made me think harder rather than just making me want to win the argument. For 5 years, those things had been noted and closed, the way you close a tab you've opened by accident. She was Claire's sister. That was the entire fence. The fence had been gone for 8 months. I'm not saying I had been thinking about Mara since the divorce. I want to be honest about this. I had not. I had been thinking about the divorce, which is its own full-time occupation, and about the house, and about the practical and logistical work of becoming a single person again after 5 years of being the other kind. I had not been sitting in my backyard cataloging my feelings about my ex-wife's sister. I had simply opened a door on a Saturday afternoon and found someone I already knew in a way that suddenly felt like it required new coordinates. And the recalibration had taken approximately 4 seconds, and was apparently visible from across the patio. I put sunscreen on her shoulders. She didn't speak. I didn't speak. After about a minute, she said, "You're being very quiet." I said, "I'm concentrating." She said, "On what?" I said, "On not making this weird." She was quiet for a second. Then she said, "Bit late for that." She wasn't wrong. I handed her the bottle and went back inside and made myself a cup of coffee I didn't want, and stood at the kitchen counter trying to have a direct conversation with myself about what had just happened. The conversation kept running into the same obstacle, which was that nothing had happened. By any external measure, two people had occupied the same patio for 4 minutes, and one of them had put sunscreen on the other one's back, and it was all completely benign. But what I understood from the inside was that the benign exterior was sitting on top of something that was not benign at all. Something I had just looked at directly for the first time in 6 years, and looking at it had rearranged something I hadn't known was still arranged. Mara came inside about an hour later. She made tea the way she always does, exact, particular, the right amount of time, and she sat at the kitchen table across from me and said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly." I said, "Okay." She said, "Is this going to be a problem?" Me being here. A pause. "I need to know if I should find somewhere else." I looked at her across the table. I said, "It's not a problem." She held my gaze for a moment. "That's not the same as it being fine," she said. I said, "No, it's not." She nodded slowly, like that was the answer she had been expecting. "Okay," she said, "then we should probably talk about it." I said, "Probably." But we didn't. Not that day. We made the collective unconscious decision that two adults sometimes make in a situation with potential consequences, which is to treat the situation as though it hasn't revealed itself yet and see if normal life can absorb it. We made dinner. We watched something on television. I told her which shelf she could use in the bathroom, and she told me my coffee maker was set to the wrong grind size, and that was approximately the whole evening. The thing that broke the surface was a phone call from Claire. She called on a Wednesday evening, 3 weeks into Mara's stay, while Mara was in the other room, and I was at the kitchen table with some work I was pretending to do. She called to talk about a logistical matter, something to do with a piece of furniture that was still technically in my name, and I could tell within 30 seconds that she also called, because she wanted to know how the arrangement was going. Claire has always been good at conducting two conversations simultaneously, the official one and the real one, and I had spent 5 years learning to hear both at once. She said, "How's Mara settling in?" I said, "Fine. It's not difficult. She's easy to have around." Claire said, "She's always liked you, you know." An odd sentence, delivered in an even odder tone, not accusatory, not warning. Something harder to read. Almost like she was offering information rather than making a point. I said, "We've always gotten along." A pause on her end. Then she said, "That's not what I said." And she let that sit between us for a few seconds before moving on to the furniture. I put the phone down and sat with that sentence for a long time. She's always liked you. Past tense and present tense at the same moment. The way some sentences carry both without choosing. I thought about whether Claire was telling me something deliberately or whether it had slipped out sideways, and I thought about what it meant that she had said it at all, that she had offered it without anger, without the territorial claim that would have made sense 11 months earlier, like she was handling something delicate and handing it forward rather than holding on to it. When Mara came into the kitchen 20 minutes later, I was still at the table. She looked at the phone. She said, "Claire?" I said, "Yeah." She said, "What did she want?" I said, "To tell me something I think she's been carrying for a while." Mara was quiet. She sat down across from me, which was becoming a pattern, us at this table, the kitchen at night, the specific quality of light from the pendant above us that made everything feel slightly more serious than it was in daylight. She said, "What did she say?" I told her. The exact sentence, word for word. Mara's face did something I didn't have a word for. Not surprise. Something that had been held in one position for a long time and was very carefully adjusting to a new one. She said, "She shouldn't have said that." I said, "Why not?" She said, "Because it puts me in a position." I said, "Or it takes you out of one." She looked at me. A long pause. "That's a generous interpretation." I said, "I have 5 years of evidence for it." She stood up. She went to the counter and stood with her back to me for a moment. Then she said quietly, without turning around, "I have 5 years of evidence for it too." That's been the problem. That was the first honest sentence either of us had said out loud in 6 years of knowing each other, and it landed in the kitchen like a stone into still water. I want to tell you what happened next, but I need to tell you about Claire first, because she is not the villain of this story, and I won't let her be flattened into one. Claire Delacroix and I had been good together for about 3 of our 5 years. The other 2 were the particular sustained difficulty of 2 people who still care about each other, trying to figure out if caring is enough, and discovering slowly and with real grief that sometimes it isn't. We did not end badly. We ended carefully, the way people who have loved each other end when they are mature enough to see what's happening before it becomes irreparable. There was no spectacular collapse. There was a long, honest conversation on a Sunday afternoon in March that lasted 5 hours, and at the end of it we both understood something that we had both been understanding separately for longer than either of us had admitted. And then there was the hard and particular work of dismantling a shared life, piece by piece, in a way that didn't destroy what had been real about it. She is a good person. She was a good wife in the ways that mattered most. The marriage ending did not mean it had been wrong to begin. It meant it had run the distance it was built to run, and we had both been honest enough to see the finish line before we hit it at speed. And Claire knew about Mara. I understood this that Wednesday night in the kitchen. She had known for long enough that she had arrived at the other side of it, the part where you've carried a difficult knowledge long enough that you're no longer protecting it, you're just handing it down because you're done with the weight. She had always liked you. Said to me, not to Mara. Said specifically. Said in the past tense, that was also the present tense. That was not a slip. That was a door, held open, extended toward whoever wanted to walk through it. Mara and I talked that night for 3 hours. Not about what we were going to do. That question was too large and too full of consequence for a Wednesday night in a kitchen. We talked about the years we had been in the same rooms and what it had cost to behave as though those rooms didn't have a particular charge to them. She told me that the hardest years were the early ones, when she had known Claire was happy and had understood clearly that the right thing and the only thing was to be glad about it. And she had been glad about it, genuinely glad, not performed. And it also felt the specific quiet cost of gladness that is mixed with something you can't name in polite company. I told her I hadn't known. She said, "I know you hadn't." That was the point. I said, "Was it lonely?" She said, "Sometimes. Mostly it just was what it was." There wasn't an alternative I was willing to consider. I said, "And now?" She was quiet for a long time. "Now there are alternatives," she said. "I'm not sure yet which ones I'm willing to consider." She went to her room at midnight. I stayed at the kitchen table for another hour doing nothing in particular. In the morning she was up before me and had made coffee, at the correct grind setting, which I chose to interpret as a gesture, and we ate breakfast and talked about something else entirely. The way people do when they have said a large thing and need a day or two to let it settle into the ground before they can stand on it. The thing that settled it was a conversation with Claire. I called her. This might seem like the wrong move, and I understand why. But Claire had opened the door. She had said the thing she said deliberately, and leaving it hanging without acknowledgement felt like a different kind of dishonesty than the one I was trying to avoid. I called her on a Thursday morning and I said, "I need to talk to you about what you said Wednesday." She was quiet for a second. Then she said, "I wondered if you would." I said, "Did you mean it the way I heard it?" She said, "How did you hear it?" I said, "Like permission." Another quiet. Then she said, "I don't know if permission is mine to give." A pause. "But I'm not going to stand in the way of something I've been watching from a distance for 6 years. That's not something I'm willing to do to either of you." I said, "She's your sister." Claire said, "I know who she is." Her voice wasn't cold. It wasn't warm either. It was the voice of someone who has thought something through to the end and arrived at a conclusion that cost her something real. She said, "I want you both to be happy." I know how that sounds. I know it sounds like a thing people say. She stopped. "It's what I actually mean. I've had 8 months to figure out what I actually mean, and that's it." I said, "Claire." She said, "Don't. I'm not asking for anything from you right now. I just wanted you to know where I stand before either of you did anything you felt you had to hide." I put the phone down and sat in my car in the parking lot outside my office for 20 minutes before I could do anything else. What she had given us was not a small thing. It was the hardest version of generosity, the kind that costs the giver something real and visible and doesn't ask for acknowledgement in return. I have thought about that phone call almost every day since. The particular difficulty of loving people in the way she had chosen to love us, not with a claim or a condition, but with an open hand. It was the most mature thing I had ever watched anyone do with something painful, and it made me understand what I had loved about her in a way I hadn't been able to articulate while we were married. Mara and I have been navigating whatever this is for 3 weeks now. We haven't put a name on it. We are two people who know each other very well and are learning what that knowing means in a context that has no previous version to reference. There are evenings on the patio that feel like something I would choose to be in if I were choosing anything. There are mornings at the kitchen table that have a quality of ease I did not expect and cannot quite account for. There are conversations that have the specific texture of conversations between people who have been honest with each other from the beginning, which turns out to be a texture I had forgotten existed. Her renovation is done in 3 weeks. She'll go back to her apartment. What happens after that is a question I'm sitting with, rather than answering prematurely, because some questions deserve the time they take. What I know is this: 6 years of keeping something in the right-hand drawer of a room I had decided I wasn't allowed to enter taught me something I couldn't have understood from the outside. The thing you carry carefully for long enough doesn't stay still. It grows into the shape of the carrying. And when the reason you are carrying it carefully changes, you don't automatically know how to put it down. You have to learn that, slowly, the way you learn most things that actually matter. Claire knew before I did. She had been watching from a distance that was close enough to see clearly. And she had made a choice about what to do with what she saw that I will not forget for the rest of my life. The gas line on the grill was fine, by the way. I remembered to check it about 2 hours after I'd gone out there. Wasn't leaking at all. Have you ever kept something at a careful distance for years, telling yourself the distance was right and good and necessary, and then had the reason for the distance disappear, and realized you had no idea how to stop keeping it? Subscribe. New story every week. I want to go back to something, because I don't think I've been entirely honest about the weeks between Mara arriving and the night in the kitchen. For the first 2 weeks of her stay, I was running a very clean and very deliberate version of normal. I was the considerate host. I made sure the bathroom situation was sorted out. I gave her a key and explained the particular way the front door lock required a specific angle of entry to operate correctly. I told her about the grocery store 3 blocks east that was better than the one on the main road, and the dry cleaner on the corner that had a sign saying 6-day turnaround, but actually came in at 4. I was thorough and practical and carefully, consciously ordinary. Mara watched me do this for 2 weeks with an expression I recognized as the one she wore when she was waiting for someone to stop managing and just be. She has always been able to see the architecture of what people are doing, the scaffolding underneath the behavior, and she has a patience about waiting for it to come down that most people don't. She doesn't push. She doesn't challenge. She simply doesn't pretend she can't see it, which is often more effective than either of the active strategies. The ordinary broke on a Tuesday evening in the 2nd week. I had come home from a work thing that had gone badly, a meeting that had turned sideways in ways I hadn't anticipated, and left me with about 4 hours of damage control ahead of me. And I walked in to find her at the kitchen table, with her laptop and a cup of tea, and the particular quality of settled attention that she has when she's working on something that actually interests her. She looked up. She looked at me for approximately 2 seconds. Then she closed the laptop and said, "What happened? Not how was your day. What happened?" Like she had already assessed that something had and was skipping the formality. I sat down and told her. Not in the managed way, not the version shaped for an audience. The actual version, including the part where I had made an error of judgment in the meeting that I was now going to spend a week untangling. She listened without interrupting. At the end she said, "That's fixable. Here's how I'd approach it." And she walked me through a specific practical sequence of steps that was better than anything I had come up with in an hour of anxious thinking on the train home. It was the most useful conversation I had had with another person about my actual work in longer than I could remember. Not because she knew my field. She doesn't, exactly. But because she listened to what the actual problem was rather than to the version I'd shaped to be listenable, and she answered the real question. I have people in my life who are warm and supportive, and who I am genuinely glad to have. What I had not had in some time was someone who was also just straightforwardly useful, who engaged with the problem rather than with how the problem made me feel. It sounds like a small thing. It is not a small thing. That was the evening I stopped running the careful version of ordinary. Not because anything had happened. We had sat at a table and worked through a professional problem, and then made dinner, and that was it. But something in me had unclenched slightly without my permission, and the architecture of what I had been doing became abruptly obvious to me, in the way that structures become obvious once you notice the scaffolding. I had been performing comfort because I was not comfortable. The performance itself was the evidence. The patio was not the first moment. The patio was when it became external. The unclenching in the kitchen on a Tuesday was the first moment, and it was quieter, and it was more important. And it is the one I come back to when I'm trying to understand how things move from one category to another without announcement. There is also something I haven't said about the house. Keeping the house made practical sense and personal sense, and had nothing, in the rational account of it, to do with Claire. But there is a version of the truth that the rational account sits on top of, and the version underneath it is that I kept the house because leaving it felt like the last thing, and I was not ready for the last thing. The marriage ending was one last thing, Leaving the house would have been another. And 2 last things in quick succession felt like more than I could absorb at once. So, I stayed, and then it became my house, gradually, with a specific slow re-personalization of a space that had been shared. I moved furniture. I painted 1 room. I acquired a plant that is still alive, improbably, which feels like a personal achievement. The house became mine in the way that things eventually do when you live in them long enough and stop treating them as temporary. And then Mara came to stay in it. There is something very strange about having someone in your space who knew it as someone else's space, who has a memory of every room that predates you being the person in it. She knew where Claire had kept things. She knew the layout of the kitchen before I rearranged it. She walked into the back bedroom in the first week and said, quietly, almost to herself, "You moved the window seat." And I said, "Yeah, it worked better on the other wall," and she said it does, and that was it. But it was also not nothing. It was a small acknowledgement that this house had a life before the current one, and that Mara was a person who contained both versions, and that those 2 things were not in conflict, but were also not simple. I thought about Claire a lot during the first 2 weeks, not in the way I had thought about her in the first months after the divorce, which was with the particular grief of something you know is right and still hurts. More like awareness. An awareness of how much of what was in this house still carried her shape, even after the painting and the moved furniture and the improbable plant. The specific angle of the afternoon light in the living room that had always been her favorite. The way the back garden still had the plants she'd chosen when we first moved in, which I had continued to water without really thinking about it. Mara had helped her choose those plants. I had forgotten that until Mara mentioned it one morning, looking out the kitchen window at the garden. She spent a whole Saturday in the garden center, she said. She had a list. I said, "I remember." She said, "You still have the rosemary." I said, "It keeps going." Mara smiled at the window. "She'll be glad to know," she said. Not with any edge in it, just the fact of it, offered simply. That is also who Mara is. She carries things without making the carrying visible. She has the kind of loyalty that doesn't announce itself, that simply shows up in small, specific details, remembering what someone cared about, speaking well of them in their absence, tending to what they tended. It is one of the rarest things in a person, and one of the things I find most valuable in someone. And it had been in plain sight for 6 years while I had the fence up. The fence is gone. What is in its place is still being determined, which is an honest answer and the only accurate one. Claire called again last week. Not about anything significant, a logistical thing, short, practical. At the end of the call she said, "How is she?" I said, "She's good. She's easy to be around." Claire said, "I know." A small pause. She always was. She said it with something in her voice that I recognized from a long time ago. Affection. The kind that is completely uncomplicated. The kind you have for someone you have loved your whole life in the plain and unguarded way of sisters. It did not sound like anything other than what it was. "Take care of her," she said. And she hung up. I sat in the kitchen after that call and thought about the word "take care," whether she meant it as an instruction or a wish or something else, something without a clean category. I decided it didn't matter which. The instruction and the wish pointed to the same place, and I intended to get there regardless of what you called the thing pointing me toward it. The renovation finishes in 3 weeks. Mara has a dinner this Friday with people I haven't met, which is fine. She has her own life and it is fully assembled, which is one of the things I find most interesting about her. She doesn't need this house or what's in it. She is here because it is convenient, and because some things, once started, take their own direction. Next Tuesday, we are going to a thing she wants to see at the museum, because she mentioned it, and I said I'd go, and neither of us has mentioned it again, but it is on both our calendars, which tells you something about the current state of things. The grill is fine. No leak, in case you were wondering. There is a moment I keep returning to, separate from all the ones I've already described, that I think is actually the center of the story, the one everything else orbits without me having fully understood that until now. It was a night in the second week, before the kitchen conversation, before Claire's phone call, before any of the things I've described had happened or been named. We had both been working late, Mara at the table, me in the study, and somewhere around 11 we both drifted toward the kitchen at the same time, the way people do in shared spaces when the work is done and the instinct for food and company coincides. She made toast. I stood at the counter eating cereal I had no real appetite for, mostly because the kitchen felt like the right place to be. We talked about nothing important. Something she had read, something I had heard on a podcast, some minor running joke about the peculiarities of the front door lock that had become the kind of reference you develop with someone you share space with. And then there was a quiet that had a different quality to it than the ordinary quiet of an evening winding down. Not heavy, not charged in the way the word charged implies something threatening, just present. The way certain silences are present in a way that sound isn't. The way a room can feel more real at midnight than it does at noon. She was looking at her toast. I was looking at the window above the sink, where you can see the edge of the garden in the dark, just the outline of the rosemary against the fence. Neither of us was saying anything. Then she said, "I used to wonder what it would have been like." Not looking at me, just saying it at the window, at the toast, at the room. If things had been different. A pause. When we first met. Before Claire, I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, "I know." She turned her head. She looked at me with the expression that was not readable from the outside, but that I was beginning to learn how to read from the inside. "You never said," she said. "No," I said. She said, "Why not?" I said, "Same reason you didn't." She held my gaze for a long time. Then she turned back to her toast. "Yeah," she said. "Okay." And that was it. That was the whole moment. Nothing happened in it that an outside observer would have noted as significant. But that was the night I understood that what we had both been carrying for 6 years was not a secret. It was a shared thing. A thing we had both known about and never named. A thing we had been keeping in the same place from opposite sides. And there is something very specific about that kind of shared silence. It is not the same as longing, exactly, and not the same as loss. It is closer to recognition. The recognition of someone who has been in the same particular condition you were in, for the same reasons, carrying the same careful weight, and never saying anything about it, because you had both independently decided that saying it would cost too much. Recognition is a different thing from attraction. It can coexist with attraction, and often does, but it is its own category. And what I felt in that kitchen at 11 on a Tuesday night was not the version of a feeling I would have had at 25. Not the urgent, unexamined, immediate version. It was the older version. The version that has been through things. The version that has some understanding of what it costs to want something and what it costs to not want it, and knows that both costs are real and neither is avoidable. She finished her toast. She rinsed the plate. She said good night and went to her room, and I stood at the kitchen counter for a while after she left, looking at the outline of the rosemary in the dark garden, thinking about all the rooms we had been in over 6 years, and what they would have looked like if we had both been honest in any of them. I don't know what the next 6 months look like. Her apartment is finished. She is going back to her own space, her own life. The assembled version of herself that has nothing to do with this house or this particular set of circumstances. We have a museum on Tuesday. We have a running joke about the door lock. We have 3 weeks of evenings at a kitchen table and 1 conversation in the garden and a silence at midnight. That was the most honest thing either of us had said to the other in 6 years. Whether that becomes something or remains what it is, a beginning or a chapter, is a question I'm holding without trying to answer it before it's ready. Some things deserve the time they take. This feels like one of them. What I know is that the patio was not the beginning. The patio was the moment something that had already been true for a long time stopped being something I could pretend I didn't know about. The beginning was much earlier, in a room full of people at a family dinner a long time ago, when I noticed the way she listened to someone who was talking too much, and I thought, without deciding to, that's what it looks like when someone is genuinely interested rather than just polite. And then I put that observation in the right-hand drawer of a room I had decided I wasn't allowed to enter, and I closed the door, and I kept it closed for 6 years. The door is open now. I'm standing in it. I'm not sure yet whether to step through or step back. But I'm done pretending it isn't there. I need to tell you one more thing before I finish, because it is the thing that changed the texture of everything else. A week after the museum, which was good, specifically good in the way that things are when the company is the point rather than the destination, Mara got a call from a friend of hers. I heard her side of it from the kitchen, short sentences, a long silence where she was listening, then a quiet okay, I'll call you back. She came into the kitchen after she hung up and sat down at the table, and did not say anything for a moment. I let the quiet be. Then she said, "Marcus is in town." I said, "Who's Marcus?" She looked at the table. "Someone I was with before I moved here, a long time ago." A pause. "He wants to have dinner." I said, "What do you want to do?" She said, "I don't know yet." She looked at me. "I wanted to tell you before I figured it out." I sat with that for a second. She had told me first, before she'd decided, before she'd called him back, before the question was resolved. She had come into the kitchen and told me, because telling me was the thing she did before the other things. That is not a trivial detail. That is what people do when someone occupies a specific position and how they think about their own decisions. I said, "You should have dinner with him if you want to." She said, "That's not what I asked." I said, "I know, but it's the right answer anyway." She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "You're annoyingly reasonable about things sometimes." I said, "Only sometimes." She almost smiled. "I don't want to have dinner with him," she said. "I wanted to know what you'd say if I told you about him." I said, "Now you know." She nodded. "Now I know," she said. She called him back in her room. The call was brief. I made tea. When she came back out, she didn't say what she'd told him, and I didn't ask. She sat at the table and picked up her book, and I sat across from her and picked up mine, and we read in silence for an hour with the kitchen lamp on and the garden dark outside the window, and it was the most settled I have felt in a space in a very long time. Have you ever kept something at a careful distance for years, telling yourself the distance was right and necessary, and then had the reason for the distance disappear, and realized you had no idea how to close the space you'd been maintaining? Subscribe. New story every week.